Welcome to the Game of Impossible podcast. This is a father-son podcast with me, Leon Jala, and my dad, Idris Jala. This is a podcast where we discuss all things transformational through the lens of business, leadership, occasionally sport, and faith as well. So thank you for joining us. Today, in episode 5, we're going to talk about winning coalition. Dad, can you tell us what do you mean by winning coalition?
It is just the idea of bringing people along with you on the journey, so that they're all part of the journey to play their part to achieve the true north. That's really what it is.
So essentially, it is stakeholder management.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is stakeholder management, not just with your seniors, but as well as your teams under your care as well.
Yeah.
Can you give us, if you like, are there, if you were to put this into 4 key pillars, what would those pillars be?
The first step is to make sure you have a helicopter view of all the key stakeholders that you intend to engage in the process. The second aspect is to must make sure that you identify agents of change, the folks that will come along with you to help you engage all those people that you're planning to engage to come together with you. And the third one is to develop a stakeholder plan. And when you do develop a stakeholder plan, the plan must involve every single one of those stakeholders that you identified. And the method of engaging them has to appeal to both the hearts and the minds. And having now done that stakeholder plans, the fourth aspect would then be to implement the plan. Get on and implement it. In implementation, everything that we talked about under episode 3 will apply. Everything under discipline of action. So if you have not listened to episode 3, please listen to episode 3 so that you understand what it means to roll out the stakeholder plan to win coalition.
I like what you said about speaking to both the heart and mind in winning coalition and in getting buy-in from your teams. Do you have any sort of best practices in terms of how to make sure that you are getting a good weightage or balance of the two?
Mandela is a classic example. As you know, prior to Mandela going to prison, he was a very hard man. He was very militant. But he spent a lot of time in prison, altogether 27 years. In the 27 years that Mandela spent in prison, he had the helicopter view of all the stakeholders. Let me describe how he did, what he was doing in dealing with the hearts and mind. He first understood that he must develop a united nation. He called it the Rainbow Nation. Rainbow Nation means all sorts of ethnicity, all sorts of religion, all coming together, including the blacks and the white. So he understood that. How did he go about doing it? He then cooperated with de Klerk. So he, together with de Klerk, worked together to then appeal to everybody. So both de Klerk and him used the hearts and the minds to appeal to both the whites and the blacks in South Africa. Then he understood that rugby is a very emotional sport in South Africa. It's almost a religion. So because of that, he understood that if he used rugby and focused on Springbok, he would be able to appeal to the emotions, the hearts of the people. And so he understood that. So that was a very big thing that he did. Was he also needed to make sure that the ANC leadership, which is a very important part of the stakeholders, that he shift the militants away from running the agenda of the party. So he used the moderates to do that. He also used religion, and that's why he then leaned on to Bishop Desmond Tutu. So the idea here was the forgive and forget. So Desmond Tutu and Mandela came with a campaign called Forgive and Forget. That's a very powerful, emotional thing that Mandela did to win the hearts and minds, because if you touch the hearts of people through religion, you go deep inside the psyche. And so the idea of forgive and forget is a very powerful thing. Not many people can do both. Many people can forgive, but to forget is a very difficult thing to do. And so he then used that to bring that forward. So I think if you look at Mandela, how did the man that was so militant prior to him going to prison come with this very clever way to engage the stakeholders to win coalition? To my mind, he must have had a helicopter view, 27 years in prison thinking about this. You know, your mom and I, including you, we all went to Robben Island. You may recall that. And when we went to Robben Island,
This was many years ago.
many years ago,
2009.
it could have been that. You remember when we went to Robben Island, we went to this place where they had a limestone quarry.
Yes.
And what the fellow prisoner with Mandela, he told a story. He said, he was a tourist guide to all of us. You remember that? He said, I am alive today because of Mandela. For 7 years, we as prisoners together with Mandela walked this quarry, carrying the limestone from one end of the quarry, bringing them all the way to the other end of the quarry. The next day, take the same limestone and carry them back to the other end. Do that for 7 years in the heat of the sun. You know what Mandela told him? When they release us, we shall forgive them. When they release us, we shall forgive them. To think about it in a sense that the man was imprisoned for 27 years. He realized through his winning coalition that he needed to embrace the whites because they were part of the nation. Whatever it took to do that, however painful the journey was, the idea of forgive and forget was a core cornerstone to what Mandela did at that time. So when I came out from that, you know what was the thing that came straight to my mind? I said, wow, I used to think Jesus Christ could forgive everybody. But the reason why he could was because he was the Son of God.
He was God.
And he was the Son of God and he was God. But Mandela is not God. 27 years the guy was locked up in the little prison that you and I saw. And he had to walk the seven years in that quarry. And he said, when they release us, we shall forgive them. Absolutely incredible.
That's interesting. I never thought about that actually, you know, because Jesus is himself the embodiment, the very embodiment of love. But as you rightfully mentioned, Mandela is merely a man operating in love. And actually, there is something quite admirable about the fact that he was able to model it in a way that is, I would say, very close. No one will ever be able to model love in the same way, perfect love, divine love. But you know, I think to the best of his abilities, I would say he's probably one of the very, very few human beings who has been able to get somewhat close to that level.
In leadership, I put Mandela on top of my pedestal.
There's a quote by Adam Grant that says that great leaders don't just create great results, they create the conditions for other people to succeed. He then says the higher you go, the more your success depends on making other people successful. And I believe that was actually the crux of Mandela's thinking. He wasn't thinking about how am I going to seek revenge for myself, but actually how am I going to make this whole nation prosper and succeed once I come out of here.
Absolutely right, Leon. I mean, you are right in saying that he was no longer looking at himself. I think that Mandela that went to prison was a man that was looking at himself as a leader that was leading a party. And when he came out from prison, he was much wiser because he had a lot of time to reflect. And what was needed, his true north has changed. The true north was changing it to create a rainbow nation. And that's why the day he stepped out from prison, it was a completely different world that he started to bring his people through. And people were rather shocked that he did not take any attempt to take revenge.
Do you think that, you know, you pointed out the fact that Mandela's true north changed?
Yeah.
I think he went into prison having a much more individualistic thinking, but came out in having a complete paradigm shift in terms of his approach. That got me thinking, do you think that in order for us to truly have conviction in the right thing, do you think that that requires us to almost go through a wilderness?
Yes and no. I think the idea of going through a very hard episode, part of life, is a very important component, but you can create it.
How do you create it?
That's the thing, see. So when in a corporate world, you reach a crisis. When you really reach a crisis, that means you run out of money, the company is really in dire straits, that's when you're hitting the wall, if you like. But you can also create the crisis by telling them, I paint a picture of the wall coming. So there are many signs that the company is in a decay, like Rome. Rome didn't collapse overnight, but there were many signals Rome as an empire was going through slow decay. But Caesar should have said to everyone, all the Romans, he said, look, I can see the signs that we're going to hit the wall unless we change. And so I think it's very important to do that. I use scenario planning to do that. In scenario planning, it said, if this, with the circumstances, if we continue along this path, we're going to hit that wall. And the consequence of hitting this wall is X and Y and Z. You paint the picture so that you create then the crisis well before the crisis do come. So you prevent it from hitting them. So in that sense, you don't actually enter the crisis, but you paint the picture that if you didn't make course correction in the journey, then you will hit the wall and you get into a crisis.
Correct. So crisis is still actually a bit of a necessary component in order to effect change, except the difference here is that rather than waiting for the crisis to happen and then react on it, we can proactively anticipate when, if it's not a crisis, then we can anticipate maybe a world that we do not, a reality that we do not want to be in, and actually anticipating that now, how can we put in measures to ensure that we don't go there? The reason why I ask this is because I think for you, your transformation journey, I think was very much driven by, growing up in the jungle and having this burning desire to get out of the jungle. You wanted a change in your reality from being in this, in the land above the hills to then going out into the city. And I think for me, a lot of that has been, I have operated based on either mistakes that I've made in the past as a leader, or dealing with my own kind of, baggage of sort of, for lack of a better term, living under the shadows, let's say. You are someone who's very prominent in the business world, and I think growing up, I have often put a lot of pressure on myself. Not from other people, it's been very self-inflicted, but a lot of pressure on myself to be able to do the same. And I think in the past, how I would deal with that is I would say, okay, that's not really my thing. I don't think I can do that. So maybe I will just detach and remove myself completely and not even try. But I think it's taken me periods of my life of seeing the folly of that thinking to then think something needs to change, and I don't want that to be the reality anymore. I want to be able to develop and to not to walk the same path as you per se, but actually to think what are the values that I can get and be very intentional about modeling from you, and then apply that in my own context as well.
Sure.
So I think my transformation journey also kind of stems from almost from a negative place, and so I think it's a good way to frame it, that we don't have to wait for it to happen, but we can actually anticipate it and move forward.
Let me add third dimension to it. So the first dimension was you're in a crisis. The second dimension was that you are anticipating a crisis to come and therefore do the things that's needed to make sure you don't get into the crisis. The third dimension, which is not negative, is that you then paint a picture of the promised land, where you really want to go, the beautiful place that you really want to go to. And then you make people realize that, my God, I really want to go there. That's a place I really want to go. And if you compare to current state you are today, that new state, that desired state is what you really appeal and you want people to go to. And that is a fantastic place to make change happen. So if you like, that's the third dimension. There's the positive side of
in
making
fact, that's
change
probably
happen.
the first thing that you need to do. You need to
Absolutely.
probably map that one out first.
Which is why we covered that in the earlier episodes.
The true north.
True North,
Yes.
we talked about that, and the game, The Impossible, really making it so appealing. That's why we talked about that in episode 1 and 2. If you haven't seen episode 1 and 2, I really encourage you to do that, because if you connect that to this episode, you understand why we are immediately referring to that.
You're getting very good at this podcast thing now, huh? You're skillfully plugging previous episodes. Very, very good. This is also a sign of us growing as we get more comfortable with this format. That's very good. Do you think there are times where obviously we want to be able to ensure that there is buy-in from as many parties, as many stakeholders as possible. But naturally, you can't please anyone, and you can't please everybody. And you have also rightfully said and have often quoted is it Marty Linsky who said transformational leadership is about disappointing people at the rate at which you would allow them to. So in light of this, do you think that there are times where there are certain parties that probably just do not require the time of day and the investment to try to convince them?
Broadly speaking, there are three groups of people that you have to deal with. The first group is what I call the folks that are believing in the journey. They really want to follow and run with you. Let's call them the crusaders. And then you have the second group, the resistance. Those folks that will reject everything that you're going to do. Whatever you say you're going to do, they are going to reject it. And they're very difficult to change. The third group is the fence-sitters. And so in the beginning part of the journey, you have, in my view, focus your energy on the first group, the believers or the crusaders. Really work with those folks, the change agents. Work with them to make results happen. When results come in the first 3 to 4 months, the quick wins, you will find the third group of people, the fence-sitters, they will begin to join. Many of them join. So what do you do in Martin Linsky's story? Making sure you disappoint people at the rate that they will accept it. So the job of leadership is to explain the rationale for the big change that you're taking. You're not going to expect them to come on board and say, we clap hands and applause you, we now come join. They're not going to do that. But you are explaining to them so that they understand it, but they will still reject it. They're still disappointed with you. So essentially, that's why the role is to explain it so that they understand it. They are not going to applaud you. So that's what you do in the beginning. But a lot of what I talked about before, in Mandela's case, he really worked very closely with Desmond Tutu because he understood that he needed to get him as a winning coalition partner. He worked with de Klerk to make sure that it happened. He worked with the Springbok team to win the hearts and minds of the folks there. He worked with the ANC leadership to make sure that the moderates within the party govern the agenda of the party rather than the militants. And so when he started to do this, that's how they roll out the change process that they were going through. I think it's fantastic work that they've done.
So actually, that's a good point that you mentioned, that sometimes stakeholder management also begins with managing the most important stakeholder sometimes, which is actually yourself. So that example that you gave earlier, there is a degree of actually managing your own expectation as well. Say you are to introduce either a policy or a new project that you want to get your teams on board with. I think there's also a degree of expectation management on yourself to acknowledge the fact that at this stage, we are going to simply state facts. This is what it is. And naturally, you might not actually get the most positive response, or at least you won't get an explicit sort of applause from it because people are just taking in the facts. And I think if you as a leader or any kind of project lead is willing to accept that fact, then you won't fall into the trap of feeling defeated from the very get-go. Oh, why didn't people seem that excited? Because I think naturally, if we are to effect any change, the first response people will have would usually be a bit of resistance. And so I think having that expectation, it gives you a bit of freedom when going into briefing that project or laying out that new policy to have a more positive outlook, even if the response isn't great.
Absolutely. Let me illustrate one closer to home. We started PEMANDU Associates, you may recall, in 2017. We had a very good run, 2017, 18, and 19, and then the pandemic came. You may remember we had a business model where at the end of each year, all the profits that we made in the company, we distribute them to the partners and staff. We kept only 2.5 months of cash, so that if we run out of money, we don't have projects, the partners will have to fork out, we call it a cash call. So the business model was we had kept very little cash so that it makes us continually hungry to run with it. So that model worked prior to the pandemic. So when the pandemic came, virtually all our contracts were either cancelled or suspended. We had absolutely zero client. And our view then was, we gathered in the team, we assessed the situation. We knew at that time that it was not going to go away in 1 month, 2 months. because our cash was only lasting 2.5 months. I asked the partners how many of them would be prepared to put out cash to run the firm for the next 2 years or 16 months. Nobody put up their hands. So we decided in March 2020, when we had the first lockdown, that we will have to do something very radical. So for the first time in my corporate life, I did this. I told the team, let's make a public vote. Every employee in PEMANDU Associates had 1 vote. I had 1 vote. My driver has 1 vote. The clerk has a vote. Everybody, we use a democratic discussion. So we devised a system for voting. We told everybody, vote which of the options would you prefer. The first option was, we told everybody, we told them we had only 1.5 months of cash. Everybody understood this. We had to take one option. Option 1 was close down the company. Option 2, mothball the company. That means close it down. For 2 years from today, after we close it down, we reopen it. Those who want to come and rejoin, they can't rejoin. It's called mothballing. The third one was reconfigure the company radically, half the number of staff. I go on 0 pay leave for the whole period. The partners have 70% pay cut, middle managers 50% pay cut, junior staff 10%. That's how we did. We get rid of the main office, all the offices, everybody go virtually, permanently, yeah? And then we go onto a virtual working. We pivot and do diversification, do things also nothing to do with consultancy. Then we had a vote. When we had the vote, it was incredible when we did the voting. The majority voted for option 3. So by middle of April, 1.5 months, we already reconfigured the company. We got rid of the offices. We cut down the staff numbers as well. We paid the redundancy for those that left us. And then I went on a 0 pay for altogether the whole period of the pandemic. And the partners had 70% pay cut. Then we started to do things that we've never done before. We were the first consultancy firm that created the only global COVID index. We programmed it ourselves. All our staff started to work on doing this. It's the only index that ranked 184 countries in the world every day on how they handle COVID. It was the only index that's approved and endorsed by WHO. So in that case, we did that for 2 months exactly, to be precise. You notice how fast we were able to do this. In 1 month, we were able to reconfigure the company. In 1.5 months, we were pivot to do something we've never done before. None of my team has ever done programming of that nature. We were able to do. By the way, the subsequent year, we had won the World IT Services Award for Excellence. I'm very proud of it because my team that did this work, led by a gentleman by the name Woody Ang, he's a phenomenal character. They did this despite the fact they've never done it before. It was truly a game, the impossible. And with the only index that was approved by WHO. And because it was relentless, the effort that everybody did. So turning back to the point was, how did we get them to win coalition? We explained to them through the minds, that we had only 2.5 months of cash. And if we didn't do anything different, the company is dead. So they understood it. We focus on the mind. How do we then touch the hearts? To touch the hearts, we will say that we have 1 vote. I'm not going to make a decision as the chairman of the company, a CEO, as a president, that this is a rule. Everybody have equal. So we brought a democratic discussion so that the majority will win. And everybody understood it. So after the pandemic, I would say subsequently, last 2 years, are record years. And we've done really well. I think our footprint, the projects worldwide, for a small firm, we have now projects in 29 countries. For a very small firm of our size, I think I'm very proud of the team that they did a marvelous job in turning around.
It's a really good example, and I think what's noteworthy about that is that approach is totally radical. I think leaving up the company's future to the individual votes of every member of staff is something quite radical and admirable. That did get me thinking, though. Do you think that democratization is required?
I would say that reward management and appraisal is a polarity to be managed, not a problem to be solved. In that, why I say that is this. If you can tell me, name a company, just I challenge you, anybody, name a company where everybody 100% are happy with the appraisal system. I don't think you can find one in the world. You cannot find. Because the reason is this. The polarity that I described is all the high performers, they want differentiated payment system. They want to be paid more because they perform better. But if you do a system that does that, the other guys who are not the low performers wouldn't like it. But they will never accept the fact that they are underperforming or low performers. They will also point it to the system. The ruler is wrong. That's why I'm measured to be short. They are never going to say I'm short, but they're just blaming the ruler. And so, but if you then create a system that is like the communist approach, that you pay people equal without regard for performance, then the folks at the high performers will be very unhappy because they said we work very, very hard, we deliver the outcome, how come we paid much the same? So I would say this polarity is not a problem to be solved. So if you want to solve the problem, to come with a solution that will make everybody happy, you will never be able to find them.
You know, Dad, I wanted to ask you, stakeholder management, I think at any level, is often complicated because there are many things out of our control. We are dealing with people from different contexts, people who think differently to us. So there's a lot in the mix. I wonder, naturally, sometimes, you know, that process of getting people along the journey with you can be frustrating. Can you share how you have helped to, how you have regulated your own sort of feelings in any transformation journey? And, you know, if possible, maybe if you could draw examples from our time in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I was around 40 years old when I was appointed as the managing director for Shell Sri Lanka. The company had lost money altogether for more than 20 years. It was run by the government. And then Shell then bought it for 5 years and lost money. So I think more than 25 years, it had been a company that lost money. I didn't understood at that time how hard the job was. So when I turned up into the job, I realized that what I was looking at directly in my face was the whole notion of winning coalition. If I didn't succeed in winning coalition, forget episode 1, forget episode 2, 3, and 4, forget it. Because the selling price for our product, which is LPG, was controlled by the government. The government had pegged the selling price lower than product cost. So when we import LPG from abroad, we already start losing money at the port. So we haven't even put them into the cylinder. We haven't done all the things that's needed to market and sell it. We already lost money at the port. So I knew that the more we sold, the more we lost money. So I immediately said to myself, my God, my only job that I needed to do right now is to start convincing the government, right from the president to the finance minister to the head of treasury, that we should negotiate this price. So I was faced immediately with a challenge. So the first thing I told everybody was, I told the marketing people and the sales people, please don't turn up for work. Because the more you sell, the more we lose money. And I guarantee if you don't come up for work, I'll pay your full salary. They thought I was crazy. I was absolutely not crazy because I knew winning coalition to change the pricing structure was the key. And so having now done that, I started the process. The management team, myself, we started to engage the government to tell them that we have to change the pricing to prevent them from putting the price lower than product cost. But you know what they said? You have a monopoly, Mr. Jala. No one else is here. If you want to do that, you must agree to get rid of the monopoly. I told the center, let's remove the monopoly. That was a concession we had to make. We don't want this monopoly. I said, I don't want this monopoly. This monopoly is a monopoly that's a poison chalice. Secondly, they said, oh, that's not good enough. We think you're making money from transfer pricing. because all your LPGs are bought from the Shell refineries. We want competitive bidding. That means we invite Exxon to bid, Mobil to bid, everybody else to bid, and we openly look at it. The lowest bidder will win. This is almost a sacrilege for the Shell Group. How can an oil company that is Shell, with joint venture with the government, now say that the lowest price comes from Exxon or from Mobil, from elsewhere, we're going to buy from them? So I had a problem with my people in the center, the head office. They said, Idris, you can't do that. I told them, look, the starting point was, if we don't get an agreement of the government to increase the price, forget it, we better close down. The only way they will get us to increase the price was to go for competitive bidding. So eventually they agreed. But to cut a long story short, the story was, when we went for competitive bidding, prior to the bidding, Shell sold the product to us as $100 per ton at the time. That was pegged. So when we opened it, Exxon, I think, came at 70, which is lower than Shell's. I was quite nervous already by that time. And then Marubeni came out at $49 a ton, which is half what Shell was doing. But fortunately for Shell, technically they were disqualified because the ships were of the wrong specifications. And the interesting thing, when we opened Shell, Shell came at $51 a ton, which is massive reduction from 100. And Petrodec, a Swiss company, also came exactly at $51 a ton. So that's how we then created a deal where for the next 5 years, we signed a deal. Half of our supplies came from Petrodec, a Swiss company, and the other half from Shell. Because we were able to do that, what was the impact, Leon? Our cost was half. Immediately, the cost was already half because we were in competitive bidding. And the government was prepared to allow us to increase the price. Every month, we were able to increase the price. And so that's how we were able to then start to make money. But of course, we still were heavily staffed. We had too many staff. We had cut costs by 30% reduction in cost. We had to reduce our inefficient work. So we made a huge coalition with the unions. We had strikes almost every month. We had strikes there. We have to deal with that. They had planted bomb at the depot as well. We had a bomb underneath the LPG sphere. If that had detonated, we have 4 LPG spheres of 1,800 metric tons. If that bomb had detonated, people who live within 4-kilometer radius would have all died, because in the industry it would have been called a blivy. And so we had to deal with the union. They took my transport manager, Soren Galagoda, hostage as well. I had to go and rescue him with 1 truckload of police and soldiers as well to take him out from there. It was a very difficult thing to do, dealing with the union, dealing with the militants, dealing with the government, dealing with the Shell office, dealing with the suppliers. It was absolutely classic
and
example.
at home as well,
and
because Mom developed panic attacks during this period.
Because we went through that, Leona. Mom went through panic attack. It was really, really, really difficult. And it was, if there was a time I felt I wanted to quit, that was the time. I did. I looked at her and she was on the floor. She had panic attack. And I said, what was this worth? What was this for? Then I started to apply for jobs outside. I found a job, 2 jobs. And in the end, I decided if I went there, it's like jumping from the fire to from the frying pan to the fire. That is also another problem in there. So I decided to stay put. I'm glad I did. So we turned around the company and made record profits, and it was fantastic.
But I'm curious, how did you navigate that period for you personally?
Personally, it was very difficult. I mean, I'm a Christian, just like you, Leon. That was the moment I was on my knees praying. I never understood what Jesus meant by total surrender. And that was the time I was broken. I was a broken man. I didn't know what to do. There was nothing in the Shell manual that taught me how to deal with taking someone on ransom with bomb, nothing like that. How to negotiate with the government. I was a relatively young guy at that time. And so those were really new things. And I really had to pray. I was on my knees crying out for
You were also receiving death threats as well at one point.
I received death threats. Every day, every other day, in the first 3 months, I received an envelope. And the guy writes down in an envelope, he says, I was a sharpshooter in the government, in the military before. I know exactly what time you get to the office. I know you take 2 roads, and I will shoot you with one of these bullets from the 3rd floor of one of the high-rise buildings.
And he mapped out the exact route, so he wasn't BSing.
The interesting thing was, I talked to our security man, and he told me, boss, don't worry. If this guy wants to kill you, he will not tell you. The reason why he tells you he does not intend to shoot you, he wants to scare the daylight out from you so that you stop doing what you have to do. He's not intending to shoot. Leon, honestly, this guy tells me all this, I didn't believe him because the fear was real. So a couple of days, I used to change the routing, not just always route A. There are only 2 ways to get to the office, either A or B. So I keep changing from A to B. But I knew at the end of the day, one of these days, if he really wants to shoot me, he will get it right because every day I'm going to the office. So in the end, I didn't. But thank God I'm alive today.
And how did you manage the stakeholders at home? I think Max and I were probably too young, so you didn't have to manage us so much. But how did you manage Mum?
It was difficult, I must say. You remember we had I told you the story. There was a minister, I think Minister of Trade. I invited him to come to our plant to plant the cornerstone for our new terminal that we're building. One morning we woke up and his photograph of his head severed through a bomb was on the front page of the newspaper. It was managing you and Max. The first thing we did was to protect you and Max. Told the guard, in future, when you see any of these gory pictures on the newspaper, please do not put it on the table, lest you and Max would see that. So we had to guard all these things and to protect you, and it was very difficult. Frankly speaking, I said, if there was any job that in my head, my whole life that I considered very, very difficult, this was the job. The Sri Lanka job was very, very difficult. And you know what, Leon? This was the job in leadership that I grew from a small boy to a man in leadership parlance. In 1.5 years, I really grew out because I was broken. In leadership, there's no breakthrough without breakdown. I was totally broken. And that's when I yielded. In Christian language, we said, the Holy Spirit, God lives within us. And that was the first time I understood what it meant to have total surrender and allowing divine intervention to come into my way of life.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to end this week's podcast. Thanks for sharing that, Dad. This has been really good, and I wanted you to talk about the Sri Lanka story because I think that leads in very nicely to next week's episode, which is on divine intervention. For our listeners, can you maybe give us a short snippet, a taster of what we can expect to unpack?
Yeah, next week we'll talk about divine intervention. The reason why we want to talk about that is simply because I would say more than 70% of what happened to each and every one of us are things that are outside our control. Now the question is, who is in control? Some of us may say it's God, some may say it's fate, some say it's luck, some say it's feng shui. It doesn't matter who's in control. The point is, what are you going to do to make sure whether fate, luck, or feng shui is going to work in your favor? And that's what we're going to talk about and unpack in the next episode.
Very good. Thanks, Dad. And thank you all for joining. We hope to see you next week. And if, we just want to appeal to you right now. This is a very awkward thing for us to do, but it is necessary. And we just want to encourage, if you have enjoyed these podcasts so far, we just really encourage you to subscribe and also hit the bell icon so that you'd be notified when a new episode drops. Thanks so much for joining us.